Let's start with the last-minute buy-high players to target before your league's trade deadline. I know a lot of leagues have trade deadlines this week. Now is the time to really be aggressive and find those guys who are going to help you win, not just over the next several weeks, but win your fantasy championship. Now, the first few guys we're going to talk about, they're kind of the guys you can target if you have a really strong roster and if you can afford to pay like a hefty price. You're probably like 7-3 or better at this point, and you have some extra pieces to play with. So the first guy on that list is kind of an obvious one. It's Devon Achane. Devon Achane, he has 35 targets in 5 games with Tua Tagovailoa versus 12 targets in the 4 games without Tua. He's second among all running backs in receptions behind Alvin Kamara. And he's finished outside the top 3 running backs just 1 time in the 5 games that he has played with Tua Tagovailoa. He is the absolute clear number 1 running back in Miami. Raheem Mostert is getting phased out of that offense. Jalen Wright gets mixed in a little bit, but he's more taking those Raheem Mostert touches. It's not affecting Devon Achane. They're so creative with him. Devon Achane could be an absolute league winner. Go buy him if you can afford to do so. Christian McCaffrey is another one. He's all the way back. His first game of the season, he played 87.5% of the snaps. He had 20 of 22 running back opportunities in that backfield. He caught 6 of 7 targets with a 19% target share. Just full-blown Christian McCaffrey role. There was no easing him back in. It was just full go, 100%. The Christian McCaffrey we're used to seeing. Jordan Mason, Isaac Guerrero, they combined for 6 snaps and just 2 touches. 2 touches between those 2 guys. Now, most teams that have Christian McCaffrey in leagues, they're probably out of contention or they're fighting to get back into contention, and they might be willing to part with Christian McCaffrey for a package deal. Christian McCaffrey could be a league winner. If you're in position to go, a 2-for-1 type of deal, Christian McCaffrey could be the guy that helps you win a championship. As could Bijan Robinson. Like I said, these first 3 guys, they're the upper echelon guys. They're probably guys that we don't really need to talk about. But Bijan Robinson, he's another league winner. You could get him in a package deal, just like I said, with Christian McCaffrey. You can get him from these teams that need multiple positions to fill in their starting lineup. Maybe they're 5-5, maybe they're 4-6, even 3-7, just hanging on by a thread, trying to get into the playoffs. You can take advantage of those teams if they need some major help. Bijan, they might want to split him into multiple starters. If you have the depth to be able to do that, go try to get that done. He hasn't scored fewer than 21 fantasy points since week 5. This is all the way back in week 5. That's unbelievable. And his fantasy playoff schedule is the Raiders, the Giants, and the Commanders. Oh, baby, Bijan Robinson league winner. Let's go. Now, let's go a little bit deeper. Not too deep yet. We'll get to some buy lows a little bit later. We're still with the buy highs. Chase Brown. Chase Brown is trending up. He's trending all the way up. He played 86.6% of the snaps in week 10. No other Bengals running back even saw the field. He had a 20% target share in week 10. And his fantasy managers, they might be a little bit worried about an increased role from Khalil Herbert. But I'm not. I'm not worried about that. I'm really not. Herbert may take some between the tackles work, and that's totally fine. That is totally fine. It's okay. He can take those not valuable touches. Keep giving the valuable touches to Chase Brown. Brown's going to continue to dominate the passing downs work. The team is trusting him a lot more in pass protection, which is really great. That was kind of shaky, his rookie year, preseason, training camp, even early this year. They just weren't trusting him in those situations. That's why we saw Zach Moss on the field so much. But Chase Brown, they're trusting him in those situations. He played a season high in snaps in pass protection in week 10, and he did really well with them. There's some highlights. There's some Chase Brown pass protection highlights out there on Twitter. He looks good. Team is trusting him. That's great to see. And Khalil Herbert, he's not involved in the passing game at all. He has 45 career receptions in 4 seasons. And Chase Brown already has 30 in 10 games this year, which is 7th among all running backs and he can handle the workload. He can handle the workload. I promise you he can. A lot of people think Chase Brown is this, scat back, undersized guy who can't take on a workhorse role. That is not true. That is absolutely not true. Chase Brown is 210 pounds. He had a 300 carry season in college. He can handle that workload. Maybe it's not ideal, but he can handle it. Absolutely can handle it. Now, one guy who absolutely can handle a heavy workload and he's going to need to the rest of the year is Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara, it's the Kamara show in New Orleans. No Rashid Shaheed, no Chris Olave, no Kendre Miller. They're going to ride Alvin Kamara until the wheels absolutely fall off. Now, that's, of course, a little bit of a risk when you're buying Alvin Kamara. There's a chance he gets injured, all that workload, but I'm willing to take the risk because he is going to have an elite role from now until the rest of the year. Buy Alvin Kamara if you can afford to do so. Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin is having the best season of his career. He scored fewer than 15 fantasy points just one time since week 2. All the way back in week 5 was the last time he scored fewer than 15 fantasy points. And his playoff schedule, Saints, Eagles, Falcons, absolutely beautiful for wide receivers and quarterbacks like Jaden Daniels. Go buy Terry McLaurin for your championship run. Jalen Hurts. If you need a quarterback, you can go and you can swing big at Jalen Hurts. He's kind of like the forgotten quarterback at the top of rankings right now. He's the QB2 in fantasy points per game. AJ Brown being back is absolutely huge for Jalen Hurts. We saw the struggle there in the middle of the season with no Brown. A couple weeks even without Devontae Smith. Those guys are back. AJ Brown being back is absolutely huge for Jalen Hurts. He looks faster this year when he's running too. Early in the year, he looked kind of sluggish. Last 6 weeks or so, Jalen Hurts looks all the way back. He looks athletic. He looks fast. He looks explosive. He's first right now among quarterbacks in carries, red zone carries, rushing touchdowns. He's third in rushing yards. And its fantasy playoff schedule includes games against the Commanders and the Cowboys. If you need a quarterback, if you want to pay up a quarterback, if you want to be really strong at quarterback for the fantasy playoffs, Jalen Hurts is a buy high. Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney is a buy high. He can be a solid wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, or flex play for you that can really, really strengthen your starting lineup for the fantasy playoffs. He hasn't been below a 20% target share since all the way back in week 6. He's wide receiver 18 in fantasy points per game. He's top 10 in deep targets and air yards. He's got a 93% route participation rate on the season. He is on the field. There's been weeks where Darnell Mooney, he's run 100% of the routes. He's out there. He's on the field. He's got a big role in this offense. He's number 6 in the NFL among wide receivers in receiving yards. He's top 15 in receptions and top 15 in yards after the catch. Darnell Mooney is a complete receiver. Kirk Cousins loves him. He's perfect fit in that offense with Cousins. He is thriving. And you look at the playoff schedule for Darnell Mooney. They got the Raiders in week 15, the Giants in week 16, and the Commanders in the fantasy football championship week. You can buy high on Darnell Mooney. He's not going to cost you as much as some of the other guys that we talked about earlier, but he's going to really give you strong production for the fantasy playoffs. Chuba Hubbard. Jonathan Brooks isn't happening. I'm telling you right now, Jonathan Brooks isn't happening. I warned you all summer, don't touch Jonathan Brooks. We are targeting Chuba Hubbard. He's been one of the absolute best values, maybe even the best value in fantasy drafts of the 2024 season. He's the guy. Even when Jonathan Brooks comes back, which is probably going to be this week, Chuba Hubbard is the guy in that backfield for the rest of the year. He just got a new contract. They just gave him a 4-year extension, $33 million. They're not just going to be like, oh, here's the rookie, Chuba Hubbard, see the bench. No, they're going to keep riding Chuba Hubbard. He's got 153 rushing yards in week 10 against the Giants. He's RB 13 in fantasy points per game, 3rd in rushing yards, 7th in receptions. He scored above 15 fantasy points more times than he has below 15 fantasy points since he's doing it in a bad offense too. He's acquirable with the return of Jonathan Brooks happening this week. That's going to scare away some of the Chuba Hubbard fantasy managers, so you can take advantage of that. He's still a buy high, but not maybe quite as high as his production would make you think that the cost would be on Hubbard. You can go and buy Chuba Hubbard. Courtland Sutton, his targets. Remember a few weeks ago, about a month ago, Courtland Sutton had a game, 0 targets, 0 catches, 0 yards, 0 touchdowns. His 0 game, remember that? Since then, Courtland Sutton has 11 targets with a 28% target share, 10 targets with a 29% target share, and last week he had 9 targets with a 30% target share. His fantasy playoff schedule includes matchups against the Colts and the Bengals. You can actually feel good about buying and starting Courtland Sutton. Go get him. Also, go get Calvin Ridley. He's had target shares of 39%, 24%, and again 39% in the 3 games since DeAndre Hopkins was traded to the Chiefs. He's had 78% of the team's air yards in week 10. Will Levis looked better. He looked better coming off that shoulder injury last week. And Calvin Ridley has the second easiest playoff schedule for wide receivers with the Bengals, Colts, and the Jaguars in the Fantasy Football Championship week. You can go buy high on Calvin Ridley. My last buy high before we get to the buy lows is Juwan Jennings. Juwan Jennings appears to be the wide receiver 2 for the 49ers. Last week in his return from the hip injury, which is really the first game that we saw everybody healthy in that offense since the Brandon Ayuk injury. And Juwan Jennings, he led the 49ers in routes. He ran a 98% route participation rate. He had a 32% target share, which led the team in receptions, air yards, and receiving yards as well. His fantasy playoff schedule looks like the Rams, Dolphins, and the Lions. Those are all teams that wide receivers can beat up on. I like that for Juwan Jennings. Go buy high on Juwan Jennings. Let's get to some buy lows. Going to buy low on Malik Neighbors. We saw the elite upside earlier in the season before the concussion. Malik Neighbors was trending towards being a top 5, maybe even a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy football. Now, the possible quarterback change from Daniel Jones, why couldn't I think of his name? Daniel Jones to Drew Lock, which is going to happen at some point. It doesn't sound like it's going to happen this week, but it's going to happen at some point. That should not scare you off. It should not scare you off. It could even be better for Malik Neighbors, Drew Lock. He's a little bit more decisive. He's a little bit more of a pocket passer, so he's not going to be scrambling. They're not going to call quarterback runs, which could mean more pass attempts in the offense. He's a lot more willing to force the ball down the field to a playmaker like Malik Neighbors. So Drew Lock could actually be good for Daniel Jones, but I've seen other people, other analysts suggest to go by Malik Neighbors, and I've seen the comments, but they're gonna bench Daniel Jones. Since when is Daniel Jones a guy that we need to propel our fantasy assets? What are you talking about? Don't be afraid of benching Daniel Jones. It's not going to be any worse. It might be better. So go buy low on Malik Neighbors. He's got the number 1 easiest playoff schedule for wide receivers. In week 15, it's the Ravens. Week 16, it's the Falcons. And then in week 17, it is the Colts. Go buy low on Malik Neighbors. You can also buy low on Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker hasn't scored a touchdown in back-to-back games, and he's coming off the bye week. So the price is down. The price is down. Everybody's forgotten about the hot start of the year for Kenneth Walker. The price is down on him. He's RB6 in points per game, and he already set a career high in receptions with 30, and he did that in 7 games. 7 games. He set a career high in receptions. They're using him much more in a true bell cow role than what we've seen from him in the past. They're utilizing him in the passing game. Don't really have to worry about Zach Charbonnet like we had to in past seasons. I still think Kenneth Walker is going to finish the season as a top 5 running back. You can go buy low on Kenneth Walker and enjoy the ride through the rest of the year. You can also buy low on Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson, he's missed the last 2 games with a hamstring injury. He's going to be back atop the depth chart as soon as he's back on the field, which could be as early as week 11. They use him a ton in the red zone. He has 26 red zone touches already, 6 goal line carries in his fantasy playoff schedule. Includes the Saints, the Eagles, and the Falcons. Go buy low on Brian Robinson. That's a really good offense. Jaden Daniels has that offense rolling. Lots of opportunities to score fantasy points for Brian Robinson. And guys like Jeremy McNichols, Chris Rodriguez, they're not getting it done in the absence of Brian Robinson. So he's going to be full role that he had prior to the injury. It's going to go right back to Brian Robinson as soon as he returns. And we can also buy low on Amari Cooper. He's missed the last 2 games with a wrist injury, which has given him the chance to sit back and learn the playbook. Remember his first game with the Bills? The touchdown that he scored, he had to look over to Keon Coleman and ask Keon Coleman what the hell he's supposed to do on his route. Keon Coleman kind of shows him what route to run. Amari Cooper runs it, scores a touchdown. Amari Cooper at this point, he knows the playbook. He knows the playbook, even if he hasn't necessarily had a ton of on-field time yet with Josh Allen. He's up to speed on the playbook. They're going to get some practice work. I think he's going to be back this week. By Amari Cooper, his playoff schedule is the Lions, the Patriots, and the Jets. It's not the easiest, but it's certainly not a tough schedule. You can go and you can buy Amari Cooper. Now, we talked about buy highs. We talked about buy lows. What about just buys? I don't know what to call it. Just buy. Just buy. They're not buy highs, not buy lows. Just kind of buy at market value. I would start there with Nico Collins. He's returning this week. Obviously, you could have gotten him cheaper over the last few weeks. If you didn't take advantage of that, it's okay. You can still buy Nico Collins. He's going to be a target and big play monster in that offense as soon as he returns. He was this close to returning in week 11, week 10, which really tells me that if he was that close in week 10, he's going to be full 100% as soon as he gets on the field in week 11. So I don't think we have to worry about a ramp-up period for Nico Collins. He's going to be an absolute monster as soon as he steps back on the field. He was the wide receiver, too, before the injury. And now that was with Stephon Diggs. Now Stephon Diggs is out for the year. Less target competition in that offense. Top 5 wide receiver rest of season, Nico Collins. You can go buy him. If you're in position to really spend up and really go buy big, preparing for the fantasy playoffs, Nico Collins is a great guy to target. Tyrone Tracy is another great guy to target if you need a running back for the fantasy playoffs. He's a full-blown bell cow now. He played 80% of the snaps in week 10. He still has room to grow in the receiving game as far as opportunity goes. This is a former wide receiver. This guy played wide receiver more years in college than he did running back. Literally last year was the first time that Tyrone Tracy played the running back position. And look how good he is already. Look how good he is. He's so good. He's just going to keep getting better. But that tells you how good he is in the passing game. He's got the hands. He can run routes. He can do so much more than your typical running back out of the backfield. You've seen it a few times, and I think they'll expand that role even more as we get later into the season, where he can split out wide. He can split out into the slot and run real wide receiver routes as a running back. He can get matched up with those linebackers and just torch them. So I think we're going to start to see later in the season, we're going to start to see more opportunities, more of a role for Tyrone Tracy in the passing game. So he hasn't even touched the ceiling. His ceiling is so far up there, you can't even see his ceiling. Tyrone Tracy. He hasn't even come close to it yet. You can buy him. He's got one of the easiest schedules for running backs for the rest of the year. Absolutely go buy Tyrone Tracy. Tyrone Tracy, if you followed yards per fantasy during the summer, yards per fantasy, this is such a huge win for the brand. Tyrone Tracy. We told you to draft Tyrone Tracy, told you to stash him early in the year. It is paying off even greater than I could have ever imagined. Rachaad White, talk about the yards per fantasy brand. Rachaad White is on brand with yards per fantasy for sure. He's the RB8 in fantasy points per game. Over the last 4 weeks, he's averaging 16.6 fantasy points per game. Over the last month of the season, he's been a big beneficiary of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans out of the lineup. Now, of course, I know we're going to get Mike Evans back possibly as soon as next week after the bye, but I still think With Godwin out, there's still going to be a ton of targets available in that offense. They're not going to Jalen McMillan. They're not going to Trey Palmer. They're not going to Sterling Shepard, Raheem Jarrett, Ryan Miller. They're going to the running backs. And yes, Bucky Irving as well is a big part of that. You can also go buy Bucky Irving. Both of these running backs are going to thrive in this offense rest of the season. I think Rachaad White would still be the guy I would target. He's still in a 60-40 split with Bucky Irving in favor of Rachaad White. In the fantasy playoffs, they get matchups against the Cowboys and the Panthers. Those could be big point totals for Rachaad White. You can go buy Rachaad White. I got two more for you before we get to a few sells. I want to start with Jacoby Myers. He's had a 32% target share since Davante Adams last played. He's got the fourth easiest playoff schedule with the Falcons, Jaguars, and Saints. Jacoby Myers isn't going to cost you a lot to go get. He's really not. He's not a buy low, but he's not going to cost you a lot. Jacoby Myers just name brand. He just doesn't have the name brand. And he's on the Raiders with Gardner Minshew. Eventually, we're going to see Desmond Ridder. Maybe Aiden O'Connell comes back. Everybody's afraid of Raiders. And it's Jacoby Myers. He's so easy to get. He could be a top 24 wide receiver for the rest of the season. They are absolutely peppering him with targets. It's two guys in that passing game. It's Jacoby Myers and it's Brock Bowers. They're going to be playing from behind most weeks, which means a lot of pass attempts. Garbage time. Garbage time points count too, guys. Garbage time points count too. Jacoby Myers is a guy who can thrive in garbage time as well as prior to garbage time. He's just going to get a ton of targets. You can go buy Jacoby Myers. And my last buy, heading into the trade deadline before your fantasy playoffs, Marvin Harrison Jr. We know what he is. He's a little volatile, a little inconsistent, but he has these big spike weeks. And you can look at the schedule coming up for Marvin Harrison Jr. They get the Seahawks twice. They get the Patriots, the Panthers, and the Rams. These are all really favorable matchups for wide receivers. They're going to give Marvin Harrison Jr. a chance to absolutely thrive and have those big spike weeks. He could give you some week winning performances in the fantasy playoffs. He could be the reason why you win your fantasy championship. It could happen. So go buy Marvin Harrison Jr. He's not terribly expensive. He's acquirable. You can go get him. Now, I'm not going to go deep into the analysis on guys I'm looking to sell. I'm just going to kind of rattle their names off. This is a trade target show, but we've got to give you some sells. A few guys on my list. Kareem Hunt. Isaiah Pacheco is coming. He's not going to happen this week. A couple weeks out, I think, still, but you're not going to, unless you need to win, unless you're scrapping to even make it into the fantasy playoffs and you need Kareem Hunt over the next week or two, keep him. Otherwise, sell Kareem Hunt because he's not going to be available to you in the fantasy playoffs. He's going to be useless. He's going to revert back to just a handcuff, which will be a great handcuff. We want to stash handcuffs. We're going to get to that in a minute. But Kareem Hunt is a sell right now, as is DeAndre Swift. He's got a really tough schedule coming up. Kyren Williams, you know how I feel about Kyren Williams if you ever follow me. I still think at some point there's a big risk that he gets injured. He's a 190-pound running back. And what really is Kyren Williams without touchdowns? We saw it this past week. It's not that good. Kyren Williams, if he doesn't score touchdowns, he's not that good. So you can sell Kyren Williams. You can sell Breece Hall as well. I think at some point we might get Aaron Rodgers shut down in that offense. Between all of his injuries, the losing season, the vibes, at some point we might just see Aaron Rodgers shut down for the rest of the year, which means you can sell Breece Hall right now. And I would also be selling Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams as well. The vibes are not good with the Jets. Sell your Jets.